possible in the process. So an economic model would tell you the ideal policy is one that would allow everybody to lie on their couch all day, just consuming anything they want in whatever volume they want. And the striking thing is that to some extent we've actually gotten what we wanted in that respect. I mean, absolute GDP growth figures have certainly slowed, but GDP is certainly higher. GDP per capita is higher than it's ever been. With all of our programs of redistribution, we do get more material to everybody at every socioeconomic strata than ever before. And so in that respect, we could declare success. The reason I think we realize that this is not success is that, of course, this isn't what life is all about, and this isn't what is important to people, and that the actual life well lived and sort of what's, I would argue, most important to human flourishing is people being able to find a role as a producer, being able to find something they are needed for, that they actually contribute to the world and provide value to others. And so, in that respect, it's really not a question of consumption, at least alone. It's a question of to what extent are we actually running an economy that creates opportunities for people to find those roles, to actually feel that they are needed, that they are contributing something, and that maybe most importantly, that through doing those things, they are able to support themselves and their families. That's sort of the punchline, I think, when it comes to the dignity of work, is that it is a two-way transaction. You are providing something of value to others, and in return, you are earning the things that you and your family need, and that is where the inherent dignity comes from, and that's where it is so important to people's well-being. And I think we just have to talk about it that way. I mean, I think at least in the US, one of the discussions that drives me most nuts is this idea that there are sort of, dead-end jobs, or sort of jobs that Americans won't do is a popular phrase. And I look at what those jobs are, and what I see is jobs that are, in many cases, the most valuable and necessary jobs to the society, especially as we learned in the pandemic, but they're ones that people are being asked to do under terrible conditions. I mean, picking lettuce in a field in 100-degree heat for 8 hours is obviously something no one especially wants to do, but it's not because there's anything inherently wrong with picking lettuce. It's in the 100-degree field for 8 hours. And then I turn around and look at somebody who's a programmer at Google, and I say, well, actually, sitting in programming all day isn't inherently a wonderful job either, but we assume that person has to do it in an air-conditioned facility with, a foosball table and a catered cafeteria and so forth. And if being a computer programmer meant you had to sit on a crate in the middle of a hot, dusty field, that would be a job that Americans wouldn't do. And conversely, if picking lettuce meant going out into the field for 30 minutes and then returning to an air-conditioned tent with a foosball table and a catered lunch, my guess is you'd find plenty of people happy to do it. And yet we sort of take for granted that one group of people should get the catered cafeteria and the others shouldn't. And so I think we need to just change how we think about what we're asking of people and what work looks like. And that then connects to the second piece, which I imagine we'll get into a lot more as we go forward. I would just emphasize here, the sort of core premise of capitalism, it seems to me, is that you throw employers, capital, investors, whatever you want to call them, into a room with workers and tell them to figure it out. And neither side can accomplish anything without the other. And for the last 30 years, through globalization, through financialization, we've essentially tried to create as many ways as possible for employers, capital, to get everything they want without having to be dependent on the actual workers in their communities and society. And I think that is the root of what has gone wrong. And I think reimposing those constraints, therefore, is not anti-free market. It is in fact core to a well-functioning free market, and what we're going to have to do if we want to restore both the cultural dignity and then ultimately the economic role of everybody's work.
Oren, thank you very much. You've given us plenty there to think about and plenty to talk about, and there'll be plenty of questions which we'll bring up for you when we have heard from our other speakers. So do stay with us. The line appears to be holding, even though we're having another thunderstorm here, so fingers crossed you will be with us for the whole session. Thank you. Let's turn to Sue Ferns from Prospect.
Thank you, Justin. Hopefully you can hear me. Like you, I grew up in the 1970s, and I agree it feels almost like a different world now in many respects. But I think one thing that has a couple of things enduring importance: individual dignity at work and collective dignity at work. So I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to contribute to this conversation. My union Prospect represents many thousands of skilled and highly specialist workers across public and private sectors of the economy, and some of those, like energy and defence, are key to creating and sustaining good jobs in less affluent communities. And that's the first thing I want to talk about, really, because creating good, highly skilled jobs is essential, I believe, to making a success of the government's levelling up agenda and ensuring that all communities can thrive in the future. Miriam will know, as an MP for a constituency of former mining villages and steelworking communities outside of my hometown, Sheffield, that many workers have been let down in previous industrial transitions. Communities consequently left to wither without sources of good, highly skilled jobs. That's why my union, I think, has been at the forefront of campaigning for a just transition to net zero, a topic that Onward has done some really good work on. And that's really important for workers in carbon-intensive industries. And this has to be a transition that doesn't repeat the mistakes of the past, but helps workers to find new, good jobs that make use of their skills, decades of experience, and keep this energy security and power our country for the future. So, for example, we'll need those workers as we ramp up our nuclear and our renewable energy capacity. I would say the government's recent energy security strategy has set out welcome and ambitious targets for the next generation of nuclear power plants, which is a good start. But we're already waiting to see a real plan for the rollout, including how we ensure we've got enough skilled workers, which is a real issue at the moment, both for building and running those plants. And of course, ensuring that we have security across that fuel cycle, including fuel manufacturer, which currently takes place outside of Preston, key levelling up community, which we have to safeguard the jobs there. And similarly, as we undergo the green revolution that we all want to see, with increased deployment, for example, of offshore wind, onshore wind, solar, investing in retrofitting, insulation, and so on, we can create jobs across the country as we realise that programme, which will help to address the climate challenge. It should help us to address the cost of living challenge. But I have to say, it will only do that if we invest in UK jobs, UK supply chains, so that we're creating that work and value in the UK, and the UK economy benefits from that. And sadly, that's not what we're seeing in the renewable sector at the moment. We're seeing too much offshoring of value and of jobs. One lesson, I think, from the pandemic, though, as we've seen a rise of more remote working, is to think about the opportunities we have not to move workers to jobs, but to move work to communities, and sometimes to remote communities. This isn't just about working from home, which can be a rather middle-class debate, but we're having real discussions about that. For example, about moving work to Dounreay and Caithness in the far north of Scotland, where there's a highly skilled workforce waiting for work to come to them. So I think that's all really important, and it would all be helped by a coherent industrial strategy. That's what we need to see. But what does this mean for individuals? This is about restoring individual pride in their sense of work, And I think, you know, good work that you can be proud of is good for you. It's part of a good life. It's good for business, and I say it's good for communities as well. And that is about treating people with dignity. There are some lessons from history. Talked about Miriam's constituency. John's Patch in Dagenham, of course, is the former home of the Ford Motor Company, where women walked out in the 1960s to protest against sex discrimination, to demand equal pay, and to bring about the change of the Equal Pay Act. Now, we've come a long way since then, but there is still more work to be done in ensuring equality and dignity at work, as we have seen very recently with the treatment of the P&O workers, which shows that our employment law is not fit for purpose. Now, despite government promises, we're not going to get the employment bill that we need, but we do have to pay attention to this, because I would say that P&O is not a one-off occurrence. There's a much bigger picture where we need to ensure prevention rather than cure, and where we need to redress the balance of power between people at work and unscrupulous employers. I'm not coming here as a trade union saying every employer is a bad employer. We work well with good employers, but there has to be constraints and safeguards against such practices by unscrupulous employers. So my union has long campaigned for a future of work that's fair, flexible for all workers. Working at home has been partly beneficial for workers who can do that. That isn't necessarily the experience of the majority, so we needed to widen that debate from a working at home debate to a positive flexibility for all workers in all roles, to ensure that they too can have some work-life balance. New technology, of course, has been a boon. We all use that as we transitioned and adapted through the pandemic, but that's brought some challenges too. The difficulty of switching off from the always-on culture, the issue about remote surveillance of people working at home, and so we need to think about that too. There's a debate about the right to disconnect, which I think is a really important one. Just to say, don't characterise that as everybody logs off their computer at 5 o'clock. It's about giving people that element of control and over their working lives, allowing them to balance their work, getting the right balance between their work, their commitment, their productivity, their reward and their work-life balance. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So let us turn to Miriam Cates, MP, and then we'll hear from John, and then we will have an open discussion. Miriam.
Thank you, Justin. Yes, as Justin said, I'm the Member of Parliament for Penistone and Stocksbridge, which is in South Yorkshire, and Sue has very kindly already referred to my constituency, and as an MP I am going to talk mainly about my constituency because that's my prerogative. So Stocksbridge is a town about 10 miles north of Sheffield. It's got a very strong steel history, as Sue has said, and in its heyday the steelworks employed around 11,000 people from the town and the surrounding area. And Stocksbridge is a very steep town on the edge of the Peak District, and the steelworks still is the dominant feature of the valley. I think it's about 2 miles long. But the steelworks now only employs about 750 people, so it's no longer the economic centre of the town. Although these are very, very good jobs. They're fewer jobs than they were, but they're good jobs. I think steelwork jobs pay about 50% more than the median wage in Yorkshire, and in my town it's more because it's a high-value steel industry. They make specialist alloys for nuclear and defence and things like that. So these are very, very good jobs. They're also high-status jobs because of the history of the work, because this is steel that's sold all the way around the world. I think 1 in 3 aircraft carries landing gear with Stocksbridge steel in it. So these are high status jobs because people have something to be proud of, something that's famous all around the world. And the steel industry, particularly in Stocksbridge, has been much more than just a good employer over the last couple of centuries. They've built the social fabric of the town, so the football club, the golf club, the community centre. Many parts of community life in Stocksbridge have their root in the steel industry, and it still continues today, although obviously it's weaker because of the fewer numbers. So these jobs were good work. They were good work in many senses. What is good work? Well, I think I've kind of isolated 5 features. There are probably thousands, but you need good pay and some sort of security in your work. The work needs to be complex. Jobs that are too easy or with no skill are not particularly satisfying. You need some sort of autonomy at work. You need dignity or status in that job, within the community, within your family. And of course, good work also contributes to the community as well. Now, since deindustrialization, if you like, since the vast numbers of manufacturing jobs have dropped so much in places like Yorkshire, where I represent, we have actually seen relatively high employment over recent decades. Now, we are entering a time of economic instability, and who knows what will happen. But certainly, a couple of years ago, we still have very high employment. But the kind of jobs that have replaced these high-value, high-skill manufacturing jobs, I don't think carry the same kind of dignity and status or pay as these manufacturing jobs. I don't think working in a call centre or in retail, as good as it is to have a job, has quite the same dignity and status and impact as the traditional manufacturing jobs. So I suppose, how do we restore these dignified, well-paid, high-skilled jobs to places like Stocksbridge, given that it's not a particularly skilled adult population where it stands now in terms of formal skills, plenty of other skills that the population have? And I've come to the conclusion that actually what we need is a manufacturing revival. I think sometimes we think of manufacturing as something that's in the past, that is not for the modern world. But actually, we've got some incredible businesses, incredible small manufacturers in this country that are ripe for expansion. Now, we're never going to compete with China or places like that for producing mass-produced commodity kind of goods. But we've got a real niche in some of the bespoke, high-value, R&D kind of manufacturing. I've got several businesses just in my constituency that are doing business all over the world with bespoke projects that nobody else can fulfill. And I think there's a real potential for expanding these kind of manufacturers. And of course, nationally, we need to address our gaps in productivity. We need to improve our balance of trade. The tech industry is really important, but manufacturing also holds some keys to productivity, some keys to research and development, and I think particularly in the north, where nothing has ever replaced that kind of powerhouse of the economy, I think we should be reviving manufacturing. Also, as Sue's mentioned the pandemic, I think we've realised during the pandemic that being self-sufficient in certain things that are key to our security and survival is actually a very good thing. I don't think we want to get to the place where we're the only Western country that doesn't secure its own steel supply. And the same goes with other industries. I think there's a very good national security and self-sufficiency argument for reinvesting in our manufacturing. So what can government do? Well, my experience from my constituency is that these businesses do have potential to grow. They do have the potential to do new contracts, to take on new people, to provide new and high-quality jobs, but there are some significant barriers to that. Firstly, things like business rates, the lack of support for high-intensity energy industries that we have in this country compared to other countries in Europe. The government could certainly work on that. Post-Brexit, we ought to have the opportunity to make sure that UK contracts are fulfilled by UK companies where possible. Again, they do that in other countries of the world. Why can't we have a guarantee that HS2, that many of our new buildings and roads will contain as much British steel, as much British other components as they can? I don't see a reason why we shouldn't do that. We also need to rethink again about skills and post-16 and school leaving, because at the moment, we now have a school leaving age that's higher than it's ever been before. It's 18. 50% of people then go on to university. Manufacturing is not at the top of many people's minds when they think of what a good job for the future. And yet when you think about the kind of skills and the kind of potential, earning potential as well that's available in manufacturing, it ought to be a much better offer. And one of the problems that we've got at the moment is that things like apprenticeships and some of the college courses don't really work for SMEs. And a lot of these manufacturings at the moment are SMEs. And I think we need to redistribute some of the money that we spend on higher education, a lot of which, quite frankly, is wasted, and give it instead to employers, to colleges, to put into on-the-job training that will give people the skills that they need to do those jobs. I'm on the Education Select Committee, and last week we heard from a number of these SMEs about their experience of training new young people up. And they're basically saying that whether people start work at 16, 18, 21, or even post-PhD, they don't have the skills they need for work, and they need to be trained to some extent on the job. So why not start that process at 16, 18, with a combination of academic qualifications, yes, but also the kind of on-the-job training that these manufacturers are so well placed to provide. So that's my thoughts in terms of manufacturing. I think it's key to levelling up in these communities. They're perfectly placed to deliver some really exciting bespoke industry. But just some kind of unrelated comments. I think also, for work to have dignity, it needs to provide. And I think back to the 70s, if one person in the family had a good job, let's say he was usually dad, the family could afford to live. The family had some sort of rootedness within the community that gave the family some status. I think we've got to the point now where even if you have one full-time earner in your family, earning a very good wage, doing a decent job, you can't afford to live. And if you're working all hours and you're doing well at work and you still can't afford to feed your family or to go on holiday, I think that robs work of some dignity. And I think we really need to look again at our model of work and care. We've got to the point where the average family can't live on one wage, and yet they also don't want to spend too much time away from their children. And I think for normal people on normal wages doing normal jobs, this is a big problem, because how does work have dignity if it just doesn't pay?
Thank you very much. Let's turn finally to John Cruddas.
Thanks very much indeed, Justin. Last year I wrote a book called The Dignity of Labour, actually, partly because what intrigued me was what 19th century economists would call the labour problem was centre stage politically in ways that hadn't been true since the 1970s. And it seemed to me to be a really interesting moment to ask the question, why was that? And it seems to me there's a few reasons why. First, obviously, is the question of the pandemic, because literally work stopped. The state moved in an extraordinary intervention in the labour market to regulate who works, when and how. The TUC and corporatism, if you want, were centre stage for the first time in 40 years in brokering the furlough programme. And the work and the vocations, the callings of many of our fellow citizens, often deemed part of the left behind, were centre stage and we relied on when we confronted death. So that was one reason. The second one is an enduring productivity crisis in this country, which is flatlined since the financial crash of the late 2000s, but longer term has characterised the economy of low-wage, low-skilled, low-productivity performance comparatively. Now, economists call that a puzzle, partly because they assumed in the 80s we witnessed a productivity miracle under the supply-side reforms of Margaret Thatcher. So I think it challenges us all to revisit how we understood the long-term consequences of the 80s. The third element, actually, is the political realignment that's occurring all around us, with the right moving into this sort of blue-collar conservatism. Boris Johnson's now talking about the desire for a new economic model. The old model is broken. The low-growth, low-skill, low-productivity model, after 11 years in charge, is now going to be jettisoned. Now, that is very challenging. It challenges the legacy of Thatcherism. It challenges the whole blue wall conservatism, whether it will allow Johnson to go where he wants to, especially when the Taylor report has not been enacted onto modern work practices. The employment bill hasn't been seen. But on the left, there are very fashionable voices on the left about post-workerism, that we should celebrate an end of work, that the working class are on the wrong side of history. Thomas Piketty's talked about the Brahmin left, the sort of economically and culturally superior elements to the left coalition, younger, urban, networked youth that is driving highly educated left political forces across the Western market economies. Very challenging for the MP for Dagenham. We used to have 43,000 Ford workers. We're now rebuilding manufacturing, just very much as Miriam said, around environmental technologies, film, new technologies. But it is a challenge. We hit the sort of red wall 14 years ago when we had 13 BNP councillors on the council because of the effects of these dramatic changes in manufacturing and the degradations that went along for traditional working class people. And the fourth element I'd point out to is people like Michael Sandel in their diagnosis of the rise of authoritarian populism, where they're basically arguing that a new politics of work is necessary because of the humiliations of the working class intrinsic to modern capitalism in terms of what's happening and the need to represent the working class, a new form of inclusive growth that challenges what he describes as the meritocratic hubris of the educated, the well-performing and the powerful in our societies, how we need to have real choices about the future of technological change and rebuild our national economies. So that seems to me to lie behind the renewed interest in the politics of work. What might that bring forward? I think it should focus on the promotion of good work. You can do that as an act of public policy. In procurement, in what you deem as appropriate in terms of the contractual compliance in public contracts, in local contracts. The Institute of the Future of Work have put out a brilliant good work covenant. And that could be inserted in public contracts around questions of participation, reward, equality, learning, You can reform the 2006 Companies Act. I was in Downing Street and we proposed to reform the Articles of Association to put a greater emphasis on the quality of the work performed in companies, but Tony Blair and New Labour balked at going there. We could revisit that. We could revisit the whole status of the vocations. We could return to Tomlinson review of post-16 education and training. We could look at the sort of national and royal colleges for the vocations, exam boards, the future architecture of vocational provision in the country. Thirdly, we can review the whole voice at work. We have more resilient capitalisms that have forms of co-determination or industrial democracy that we've never engaged with in this country. We could again change the articles within company structures to ensure that they put greater emphasis on the needs of workers over and above simple stakeholder, shareholder representations. We could go to worker ownership funds that have been looked at in Scandinavia. We could actually go to a new area that's opening up around personal dignity in the organisation of work, the desire for mental privacy, personal data, the increasing power of surveillance at work, especially those working at home. That's a new area that we could think about regulating and providing new policy options. In terms of rights at work, we could redefine the categories of worker in terms of employee, contractor or worker and put a new floor underneath the labour market. In terms of rights at work, we could have a new stimulus around education, care and environmental structures rather than simply a dash for future tax cuts. I think despite the logjam in the Senate, Biden's work around his desire for 18 million jobs, his rescue plan, jobs plan, family plan, are pretty instructive there. Or more generally, we could excavate American history and go back to FDR's 1944 Second Bill of Rights and the right to work in this country enshrined constitutionally. That would be quite challenging in returning to the question of dignity in work. We could put work at the centre of public policy and government activity in terms of a new Department of Work, overseeing an integrated regulation regime, overseeing a supply chain, contract compliance system, and politics of enforcement, providing a new evidence base about what we know about the modern world of work. And finally, I would say we could have a new national assessment about work futures that looks at some of the ethical changes around automation and some of the degradations intrinsic with technological change in the future, and challenge that and make sure that we put good work centre of public policy, whoever's in charge. So that's just a few ideas, but there is a very interesting dynamic by which the quality of work and human dignity are now centre stage in the political debate in the country. And I think we're just at the early skirmishing around what that future politics might look like.
Well, let's stay, if we can, on the future politics of this subject. And Oren Cass, from your perspective, from the American perspective, is liberalism, we talk about Thatcherism here, and I suppose it would be Reaganism, your side of the pond, is that over now? Is everyone who is thinking about this realising that the importance of community and of place trumps that of globalism?
Well, I certainly don't think it's over. You know, in the U.S. at least, and as you said, we would call it Reaganism. The sort of related ideology is typically called fusionism, which refers to, on the right of center, this coalition that Reagan really brought together that combined economic libertarians, social conservatives, and Cold War foreign policy hawks. And I think a lot of what we're seeing right now is a divorce between those economic libertarians and social conservatives. And therefore, in part, a question of, well, what would it mean to actually be an economic conservative? Because, of course, you know, what we call in America conservative economic policy typically just means tax cuts, free trade, deregulation. There are times when those things are good ideas, but those aren't inherent, permanent conservative ideas. And so there's absolutely still that economic libertarian streak. There are people within the Republican Party who would like to hold that Reagan coalition together and even lean further into the very libertarian view. But I think certainly both in terms of number of voters, in terms of momentum and ideas, there's been a very serious shift. And what you see ascendant in American conservatism is this what I would call actual conservatism, this question of what does it mean to apply conservative principles to today's economic challenges. And that brings you to these questions of community. You know, one thing it very interestingly brings you to is these questions of labor and a labor movement that actually recognizes that worker solidarity is something conservatives should want to embrace. And so I think that's certainly the direction we're headed. But there's also certainly that's very much what the fight is.
But on the other side, on the left in American politics, you also see that division, don't you, between those who are interested in the politics of identity, etc., in the Democratic Party, and those, including the president, the kind of Scranton side of things, those who do believe in place and do believe in the dignity of work in place. Where do you see the balance falling there?
Well, I think unfortunately the fight is closer to over on the left and in the wrong direction. You know, I think it's telling that you would identify President Biden as a representative of that worker focus on the left, when if you look at what his actual policy agenda is, you know, what he's sort of stuck his neck out on, it is almost all the identity related issues. Now the sort of top thing he's pushing on is student loan forgiveness, which you know, overwhelmingly would favor the upper class. And so I think you really see, at least in terms of the current focus, an overriding shift away from real concern for the issues of the working class on the left of center.
Where does that stand here? I'll ask both of our politicians and then turn to you, Sue. Miriam, who's winning the fight in your party? We all know it's there, don't we? There is a Thatcherite wing still, and a kind of sense of the importance of what she achieved, but also a sense that the atomization that happened to us wasn't necessarily for the good.
Yes, I think that's right. As you said, there definitely is a Thatcherite wing. I'm not in that category. But no doubt, you know, she was a strong leader. She had principles. She was a good leader in a very difficult time. But I think if you grew up in the north, as I did, grew up in Sheffield in the 80s and 90s, as a Conservative, you see it in a very different way, because although she had to tackle the unions, although the coal mines inevitably were going to close, nothing replaced those good industries. And that's the problem. It wasn't that change couldn't happen, because of course change has to happen. But no thought, or at least it appears that no thought was given to what are those communities going to do? Because entire communities were built around these industries. There weren't, you know, transferable skills that you could suddenly do something else. And I think that's where it went so wrong for the North in terms of the deindustrialization and the lack of provision to replace it. But on the other hand, I do think this idea of social conservatism is very important, because whilst a lot of my constituents certainly wouldn't call themselves Thatcherite economically, some of the more pro-family, pro-community policies that Conservatives probably have more than those on the left, certainly at the moment, very much chime with my constituents. They are rooted in their place, they are rooted in their family, and actually they talk more about some of the social things, you know, the identity politics and things like that, than necessarily just economics. So I think both are important, and it is very difficult as Conservatives. The state is absolutely enormous now. You know, the tax bill is bigger than it ever has been, but on the other hand, we're living longer, we're spending less time in work proportionally, so that's almost inevitable. So for me as a Conservative, it's not about how do we shrink the state as much as possible, it's how do we make the state more neutral. So at the moment it's pushing people to certain decisions, how do we make it less?
And John, when we look at the dignity of work, and particularly what I suppose you'd call kind of kinetic work, the sense of what Miriam was saying, that manufacturing, building stuff, doing stuff, sometimes with your hands, but actually involved in a complex process, that there is an interesting kind of school of thought, isn't there, that says that also, along with it, goes in your mind then an attachment to a locality that makes you believe a certain set of things that probably are socially conservative with a small c. Is that reasonable?
I think that's very well put, actually. And that was that tradition created core tenets of the Labour tradition over the last 150 years. Now, to me, I mean, the jury's out about where this debate's going to go within the left and right, because it is very challenging for the left, within the left, because I was there when New Labour were in power, and we had ongoing debates around stakeholding, which was basically code for bolting the working class back into the operation of the economy. And instead, we pursued a sort of compact with finance capital based on low regulation, back-end fiscal transfers through tax credits, rather than rebuilding the status of the vocations and the dignity of labour. That was a conscious political choice. We lost, actually, because that was the debate within government. And there's a similar sorts of debates now going on in Labour. They're even more profound around the very nature of work, or whether we should be seen as a post-work movement that celebrates a life of luxury and abundance and universal basic income, or universal, there are very significant, profound debates in terms of the historic character of the party. I'm very much on one side of this debate, and that's probably the way I caricatured some of my fellow colleagues in my party as a disservice. But you can see the terms of debate opening up, especially when the present Prime Minister is challenging, through the levelling up agenda and the work of organisations like Underwood, a very radical reset of what conservatism is. And that should be seen as really challenging and demanding real agile responses from the left, because it's up for grabs where we end up on this. And to my mind, we need to return to these questions of stakeholding and rebuilding the status and dignity afforded by work of all its different elements, and not just knowledge work, because we assumed in the 2000s, there was a revolution in work, that traditional work was in decline through the notion of a knowledge-based economy. And you see similar debates today, and it was more of a much more mixed economy that we should have been nurturing and developing, which I think led to Brexit, actually, in many respects, led to a lot of the red wall eruptions. You can see it still being played out today.
Are we also heading towards a more closed economy? You mentioned British jobs and offshoring and all the rest of it. Are we now much more open with ourselves about saying, it was Gordon Brown's phrase, wasn't it, Britain first, which didn't get him very, very far, and was misunderstood and used by people. But is there a kind of Britain first attitude, something within the union movement now, that it's at least something to talk about?
Well, inevitably it is, especially post-Brexit it is. Do I think that means we're introspective? No, I don't. But I think it means that for a lot of people, the dignity of their labour, the standard of living, the nature of their communities is such that they feel that the world is shrinking, and they are concerned about what's happening to them, understandably so. And actually it is right, isn't it, that in our economy, where we have very highly talented people, we've got good R&D, we've got good IP, why should we and why should British workers not reap the benefits of that? And we're seeing too many cases, including in emerging industries, where that is not the case. So I think in that sense, this is a very real debate for us to have. If I have members who are losing their jobs for whatever reason, of course I want them to have access to good, satisfying, skilled, rewarding employment. I don't see anything wrong with that. And I think, John's point about we need more of a mixed economy, of course we do, and we need to learn lessons from the pandemic about how we value work and how we value different types of jobs. Now, I don't think it's all about manufacturing, and I don't think it's all about turning the clock back either, because although some things were better previously, for women, from people from minority ethnic communities, absolutely they weren't. So it's how, I think the debate is how you reap that benefit of the dignity of work, which builds communities, which builds pride in communities, but do it in a way that everybody benefits from it.
Let me throw it open to anyone who wants to ask a question or indeed say something. Yes, several. Let's start with you right at the front, and then we can move around. Here we go. Wait for the microphone if you wouldn't mind. Shoot.
Thank you very much. My name is Richard Harris. I'm from the Institute for Community Studies. And by way of declaration, I should say that I was a branch rep for the union that became Prospect. Back in the days when the government was doing market testing, it was quite a demoralising time, actually, because trying to get my fellow workers sort of engaged in that and was really difficult. They didn't want to. They'd paid their subs. It was someone else's job to deliver it. And it was a real example for me of Charles Taylor's concept of the buffered self. That, you know, they were all right in a sense, and why should they mobilise for the common good? And that's the background to the question I wanted to ask, because hearing all the contributions from the panel, they all come from a certain direction, whether it's about providing manufacturing, or about different company structures, or about better legislation, or about air-conditioned foosball tents for lettuce workers. There's a presumption that dignity can be given to working people. And I'm just wondering whether the panel think there's a role here for community power, because those workers in Dagenham in the 60s didn't get this because they were given it, well, they were given it, but they demanded it. So where and how can you create the incentives to generate bottom-up community power to work alongside the top-down proposals you've
Right.
got?
Hold that thought, and I'm going to ask for our other question as well, and we'll take a couple at a time, because yes, over there, and then we'll come across to the right hand. Yeah.
Hello, Paul Dinsdale, writer and editor. Just first part of the two-part question. First part for John, really. When you were talking about the new economic model that Boris Johnson's been talking about, isn't he really taking up where Tony Blair left off with his third way, when he used to talk about the third way between not the old-fashioned state socialism and not leaving everything to the market? Do you think he's just repackaging that as a policy? And then a broader question, is there a case for a smaller role for the state now in terms of people working for the state, civil servants, obviously with the plans to get rid of 91,000 posts, I think, in the civil service. Is it fair to workers in the private sector that people in the state sector have index-linked pensions and often a job there for life?
John, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, I think there's quite a common drumbeat that's developed since the Queen's speech last week, saying there's nothing to see here, this is a government's run out of steam, there's no ideas, there's sort of 38 random bills coming together. I have a totally different view about it, actually, when it comes to the possible levelling up agenda, what the Prime Minister's saying about rejecting the old economic model that offers diminishing returns is a direct challenge to the whole sort of post-war economic history of Britain, if he carries through. Now, whether he carries through is a totally different question, but I take him quite literally and cast that alongside some of the questions around European retained law or abolishing the Human Rights Act. There is a very radical agenda. I disagree with loads of it, but there's a lot of radical policy ideas that will come out of this Queen's speech. The real question is, will they deliver them, to me? On the economy, I think the sort of blue wall Tories in the South will stop the reinvestments in the North and the Midlands, and they will not accept the challenges that sort of approach poses to the legacy of Thatcherism. That is the one thing you cannot go to as a Thatcherite, I think, because they think this miracle in the 80s was built around a deregulated labour market. And to me, if you want to rebuild the dignity of labour, you're going to have to, that's unfinished business of the later part of the 20th century, the effect of Thatcherism, for Labour as well as Conservative, by the way. And if we're going to really drill into some of this stuff, then we have to confront, you know, you're going to get a small productivity bump if you get rid of 2 million manufacturing jobs, but it could well intensify long-term structural problems about low wages and low skills, which we have to, at some stage, confront. So I take him quite literally. I doubt he's going to be successful because I don't think his party or his history will allow him to be, but I sort of wish him well, because I welcome a Prime Minister saying we've got to reject this broken model and change things.
What about the question about power not coming from those who suggest this, that and the other, but actually coming from communities? Miriam and then John.
Well, I think there's an assumption behind that employers and employees are always at war, and I don't think that's true. It's certainly not the case in the businesses in my constituency, and in particular in a market where employers are so desperate for employees, there's a strong incentive to collaborate. And particularly thinking of my steelworks, fantastic relationship between the community union and the directors and the bosses at the steelworks. Very good collaborative working, very solid understanding of each other's problems. And of course, traditionally, the industries that have been unionised have managed to have better pay, as we again saw in the pandemic. So I think there is absolutely scope for more bottom-up, but I think particularly in SMEs, there already is a very good, strong relationship between employers and employees, and actually the onus is on government to get out of the way of the growth of those businesses rather than necessarily to mediate those two roles.
John? I very much take your point about in Dagenham, the dignity of the working class was not given to them. They have to fight for it, right? And that is still an ongoing contest. And actually, the most interesting questions are whether you can push modern politicians to give power away. And it's not just about state capture, it's about handing things over, letting go. Because that will be the new currency of politics, I guess.
We've got a few more minutes, and there was one question over there. Yes, right in the middle. Here we go. We get a microphone across.
Thanks very much. Simon Kay from the think tank Reform. I'm going to ask the inevitable David Graeber question. There's a kind of a purposiveness and a dignity crisis, not only at the bottom end of our economy, but in the upper middle classes of employment as well. So how do we avoid this very animated drive towards improving the stakes for people who are worst off in our economy, just ending up in more, forgive me, bullshit jobs?
Let's put that to Oren Cass, because it's something. There are plenty of those jobs in the United States, aren't they, Oren? And you've taken aim at some of those who are in them.
Well, I guess I should say I'm a little bit skeptical of the Graeber bullshit job thesis, just because I think generally the ones that he picks on tend to reflect maybe not the best understanding of what modern organizations actually need. And so to take, HR as an example, it's all well and good to say you don't understand what all these HR people do until you're running a large organization. And then believe me, you very quickly understand what all these HR people do. And I think it's also the case that, if there's anywhere where the market functions quite well, it is in pressure on corporate executives to downsize their headcount. So I'm somewhat skeptical that there are a lot of people sort of sitting around doing things that no one needs to do in jobs that could be eliminated. I think there are certainly big problems with corporate culture that could be improved upon. But it seems to me that our concern shouldn't be, we're going to move everybody up into these other jobs that are also terrible. It's to put it a little bit differently, which is that, not everybody's aspiration is to have that kind of job. And in fact, not most people's aspiration is to have that kind of job. And I think the point that came up earlier in the education context is very relevant, which is that, at least in the US, the sort of ideal that we all have in mind is you're supposed to, go off to university somewhere and then get that degree and then go, find the career in the city that uses it, and off you go. If you actually survey people, even putting aside how many would be able to achieve that, most people don't want to. Most people do have that rootedness and sense of place. A tremendous number would prefer to be doing something kinetic, which I think is a great term. I hadn't heard it described that way before. To the point about the disconnected, the right to disconnect, an awful lot of people prefer a job that you can leave at the end of the day and not hear from again until you show up the next day. And so I think the most important thing we can do is redefine success away from getting that 4-year degree, advanced degree, and so forth, and then going off and doing that job at a desk. And that's great that those opportunities exist, but
the perils of unconnectedness. Oren, I'm going to bring it to an end now because we've run out of time. But it's fantastic to have had you on the line, and that the line has existed and. Speakers here, and a round of applause, please, for all of them.
to go? Okay. So can we just wait for 3 minutes? Yep. Can we? Yeah, and we can make sure the stage is ready. It's ready. So we're okay to. Yeah. Yeah. So we're just getting people in. And you need to go at 3:30 promptly. Yeah. So just